The storm struck Snakebite Pass like nature's own fury, transforming the abandoned mining camp into a maelstrom of mud and debris. Rain hammered the broken-down shacks and rusted sluice boxes with relentless force, while lightning carved jagged scars across the desert sky. The creek, normally a lazy trickle through the gulch, had swollen into a roaring beast that devoured everything in its path. Fence posts, barrels, tools, and the shattered remnants of dreams that men had buried in this god-forsaken place. At the edge of what had once been the main camp, where firelight flickered against the driving rain like dying embers, a young woman sat trembling in the mud. Matilda Hawthorne Tilley, to those who knew her, looked like death incarnate. Her traveling dress was torn and filthy, the light-colored fabric clinging to her shaking frame. But it was her right ankle that told the real story, swollen to twice its normal size, and dark as a thundercloud, bearing 2 neat puncture wounds, weeping blood and venom. The rattlesnake that had struck her was likely floating downstream by now, torn from its nest by the deluge, along with everything else that couldn't hold fast. But the toxin it had pumped into her leg remained very much alive, racing through her bloodstream like liquid fire, making her vision swim and her heart pound with more than fear. A shadow materialized through the rain-soaked darkness, and suddenly a man knelt in the water before her. Apache, his bronze skin gleamed in the firelight, his long black hair bound with leather cord, his clothes a mixture of traditional buckskin and white man's cotton that spoke of a life lived between 2 worlds. Perhaps 30 years old, with a kind of quiet strength forged in places where weakness meant death. His hands settled on her calf with steady precision, washing away venom and mud with methodical care. The water ran cold as winter, but his touch carried warmth, and when their eyes met across the small space between them, something passed that was practical, as breathing yet deeper than words. "Hold still," he said, his voice low and rough, like wind across stone. "Snake medicine takes patience. Rush it, lose the leg." No tenderness in his tone, no false comfort. Just fact delivered plain. But his hands never wavered, never hesitated, and when he looked at her, truly looked, it wasn't with pity or desire. It was assessment, pure and simple. Measuring her chances, calculating necessity, deciding whether she was worth the effort. She found herself doing the same to him, taking in the controlled way he moved, the careful economy of his gestures, the old scar running from left temple to jaw. This was a man who'd seen trouble and survived it, who knew the difference between what mattered and what didn't. "What brings you to this cursed place?" she asked through chattering teeth, studying his face for signs of deception she'd learned to recognize in 26 years on the frontier. "Dakota," he said, ignoring her question, but offering his name. "Water's rising. We talk later or we don't talk at all." Behind them, the fire sputtered as rain found its way past their makeshift shelter, a tarp stretched between broken wagon wheels. Beyond the circle of light, the camp was being systematically destroyed, piece by piece. But here in this small space between disaster and salvation, time seemed suspended. Dakota's attention was absolute, focused on her leg with surgical intensity. He produced a strip of cloth torn from her own chemise, she realized, and began cinching it tight above the bite to slow the poison spread. When she instinctively moved to stop him, thinking he was being too rough, he paused and met her gaze. "Trust me to do what needs doing," he said quietly, "or die pretty. Your choice." She let her hand fall away. The tourniquet completed, he sat back on his heels. Water streamed from his hair and clothes, but he seemed oblivious. "How long since the bite?" "Maybe an hour. Right after the water started rising. I was freeing a mule when that blasted snake appeared from nowhere." She watched his face as she spoke, noting how he absorbed information without judgment, filing details away, like a man accustomed to making life-or-death decisions on incomplete information. "Your husband?" The question hit like a physical blow, bringing back Edward's face twisted with disgust as he stared at her swollen ankle. His voice cold and factual. "You'll slow me down, Matilda. Natural selection at work." The sound of his horse's hooves as he rode away with the strongbox, leaving her to die alone in the rising waters. "Gone," she said simply, tasting the bitterness of abandonment. Like smoke when the wind changes. Dakota studied her face, reading the story written there with the same careful attention he'd given her wound. Then he nodded once, confirming something he'd already suspected. "We need to move. This shelter won't last." As if summoned by his words, a section of tarp tore loose, snapping in the wind like a gunshot. Rain immediately pooled where they sat, turning earth to muddy soup. When Dakota moved to help her stand, Tilly caught his wrist. "Why help me? I'm nothing to you, just another white woman who trusted the wrong man." He could have offered platitudes about Christian duty or frontier hospitality. Instead, he simply looked at her ankle, then back at her face, and she saw something in his dark eyes that reminded her of the way she looked at a woman in difficult labor, assessing chances, calculating risks, deciding whether to fight or surrender to fate. "Because you're not dead yet," he said, "and because some choices echo louder than thunder." It wasn't poetry or romance, just truth served cold and plain. But in that moment, with the storm raging and chaos consuming everything around them, it was exactly what she needed. Not false hope, but acknowledgement that she still had fight left, still had choices to make. She released his wrist and let him pull her to her feet. The high desert of New Mexico territory stretched endlessly in all directions, a harsh landscape operating by simple rules: adapt or perish. This was late 1870s frontier, when the territory remained raw and unsettled, when justice came from gun barrels more often than judges' gavels, and when a woman's life was worth exactly what her husband decreed. Prairie Dawn squatted on the landscape 30 miles south of Snakebite Pass, a collection of adobe buildings and false front stores, existing primarily to separate miners from their silver and cowboys from their wages. It boasted Henderson's General Store, the Golden Ace Saloon, a one-room schoolhouse doubling as Sunday church, and Dr. Eliza Boone's clinic, a cramped affair redolent with carbolic acid and broken dreams. Tilly had called Prairie Dawn home for 3 years, ever since Edward had dragged her west from Missouri with promises of silver strikes and easy wealth. She'd established herself as the town's midwife, carrying a leather satchel filled with boiled cloths, willow bark powder for pain relief, and a pocket ledger recording debts from families too poor to pay in coin. The work was backbreaking and often heartbreaking, but it gave her purpose reason to rise each morning, even when Edward's drinking made nights long and bitter. "Mrs. Morrison's breathing tells me her baby's turned wrong," she'd told Dr. Boone just the week before. "But there's something else her skin's got, that gray pallor I've been seeing too much of lately. Same as the Hendricks woman before she died." Edward Hawthorne was what polite society called a businessman, though his business involved more scheming than producing. 42 years old and handsome in a polished way that reminded Tilly of a serpent. Before striking, he possessed the kind of charm that could separate fools from their money, faster than flash floods separated men from their horses. "My dear investors," he would say, raising his glass in the Golden Ace, "we're not just extracting silver from these mountains, we're extracting the very future of American prosperity. A toast to progress." But his eyes, Tilly had noticed, never smiled when his mouth did. His partnership with Silas Barrow to work the Snakebite Pass claims used mercury amalgamation to extract silver from ore, a cheap process, leaving tailings poisoned and downstream water unfit for man or beast. What neither Tilly nor the townsfolk knew was that Edward and Barrow had been dumping mercury waste directly into the creek, feeding Prairie Dawn's wells. The man who'd pulled her from the deluge at Snakebite Pass was mystery of an entirely different sort. Dakota moved through the world like smoke, present when needed, gone when not. He spoke little and observed much, something in his dark eyes, suggesting he'd witnessed more than his share of humanity's capacity for cruelty. 18 months ago, Dakota had been cast out from his own people for refusing an order during a raid. The war party had encountered a shepherd family's wagon, a man, his pregnant wife, and 2 small children huddled in terror. The war leader had commanded the wagon burned with the family inside. Some lines once crossed leave marks on a man's soul. Dakota had told the war leader, "I will not carry that mark." His refusal had been deemed betrayal. The war leader had offered a choice: kill the family himself to prove commitment or face permanent exile. Dakota had chosen banishment, and the shepherd family had lived. The beaded bone choker he wore was all that remained of his former life, reminder of the promise made to his dying grandmother to always protect innocence regardless of cost. Dr. Eliza Boone was 53, a woman who'd come west after her husband died in the '73 cholera epidemic. "I've seen enough death," she would tell her patients, "to know when it's coming uninvited." She possessed sharp intelligence that cut through lies like blade through silk, and she'd been watching Edward Hawthorne with growing suspicion for months. "Tilly," she'd said just days before the flood, "I need you to look at something. These symptoms I've been documenting, they're not random. There's a pattern here, and it's starting to frighten me." The flood was no accident. That was Dakota's first realization as he guided Owen Pike's skiff through debris-choked current toward Prairie Dawn. The water had risen too fast, too violently for natural runoff, even accounting for the storm. And there was something in the air, a sharp, acrid smell having nothing to do with rain or mud. "Current's wrong," said Owen Pike, his weathered hands steady on the steering oar despite the chaos around them. The 63-year-old ferryman knew every rock and eddy of this water stretch. 40 years I've been reading this river, and she's never spoken like this before." Dakota guided them toward a sandbar where current ran slower. Eastern sky was beginning to lighten, painting storm clouds in shades of gray and rose, and in that dim light he could see canyon walls where Snakebite Creek began its valley journey. "Look at the rock face," he said to Tilly, who was pressed against his side for warmth. "Where the water's coming through." She squinted, trying to focus through pain and gathering daylight. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just natural scarring where decades of flash flooding had carved channels through stone. Then she noticed what Dakota had spotted: fresh white scoring on canyon walls, too regular and precise to be natural. Someone used explosives. She whispered her midwife's experience with anatomy, making her sensitive to wounds, both natural and inflicted. "That's not erosion, that's deliberate cutting. Recent, maybe 6 hours ago, right when the storm hit." Dakota beached the skiff and climbed onto wet sand, moving with the careful silence of a hunter examining sign. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Dynamite residue on this timber. Same blue powder they use in the mines." Young Jesse Pike, Owen's 15-year-old son, looked up from the telegraph key he'd been protecting from the rain. "Pa, remember what Mr. Henderson said about seeing lights up the canyon last night? Thought it was lightning, but it was before the storm hit proper." The implication struck Tilly like a physical blow. Someone had deliberately destroyed the natural dam, normally regulating creek flow, timing it with the storm to create maximum damage. "The tailings," she said, suddenly, pieces clicking together. "Edward and Barrow's mercury waste, if someone was asking questions. Decal deluge washes away evidence real fine." Dakota agreed, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who'd seen too much of human evil. Question is, who's asking the questions that need washing away? Sound from upriver made them all look up, hoofbeats on wet stone growing louder by the second. Through morning mist, they could see riders on the far bank, 4 men pushing horses hard despite treacherous footing. Even at distance, there was no mistaking Edward's bay stallion or the man who rode with such careless arrogance. Edward reined up when he spotted them, his face cycling through surprise calculation and finally settling on cold resolve. Behind him rode Silas Ketch and 2 men Tilly didn't recognize, all armed and looking like they had urgent business elsewhere. For a moment, husband and wife stared at each other across swollen waters. Then Edward's jaw tightened, and Tilly saw something in his expression that chilled her more than venom in her veins. "Well, well," Edward called across the water, his cultured voice carrying clearly in the still air. "My dear wife survived after all. How inconvenient." "Edward," she called back, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I see you managed to save what matters most." She nodded toward the bulging saddlebags on his horse. His smile was sharp as winter wind. "Business before sentiment, my dear. Always business first." He turned to Ketch. "Clean up this loose end, Silas. I'll not have my affairs complicated by sentiment." But something in Ketch's face had changed as he looked at Tilly, pale and wounded, but defiant. "She's hurt, Edward. Snakebite. Might not survive anyway." "Might isn't certainty," Edward replied, his voice hardening. "I pay for certainty, not possibilities." Before Ketch could respond, Edward wheeled his horse and spurred it into a gallop, other riders following. But Ketch hesitated, staring across the water at the woman he'd been ordered to kill, seeing something there that made his gun hand stay still. Finally, he holstered his weapon and rode away, leaving Tilly alive, but with the certain knowledge that Edward would not make the same mistake twice. Sheriff Murdoch's voice carried across the water like thunder, full of artificial authority and genuine menace. "That's far enough, you're harboring a fugitive." The posse had found them just as Owen was guiding the skiff into the main channel toward Prairie Dawn. 6 deputies on horseback badges, glinting in morning sun, and their weapons trained on the small boat bobbing in the current. "Surrender the Hawthorne woman, Apache," Murdoch continued. "She's wanted for theft and conspiracy." Tilly almost laughed despite the danger. "Theft and conspiracy," she murmured to Dakota. Edward's been busy spinning his tales. "In my experience," Dakota replied quietly, checking the loads in his weapons, "guilty men always accuse others first. Misdirection is older than sin." Owen Pike had been running his ferry service for 15 years, and he possessed the riverman's instinctive hatred of anyone threatening travelers under his protection. "Jesse," he called to his son, "run that signal light upstream. Make them think we're heading for Miller Ford." The boy was quick and clever, waving the lantern in a pattern suggesting a skiff trying to reach upstream shallows. Several deputies spurred horses in that direction, following the false signal while the real boat slipped deeper into the main channel. But Sheriff Murdoch was no fool. He kept position, tracking their actual movement with a hunter's patience. When his rifle cracked, the bullet passed close enough to Tilly's head that she felt its wind part her hair. "Here," Dakota said, pressing his spare Colt into her hands. 2 rounds. Make them count, but remember, dead men tell no tales, but wounded men spread fear. Tilly had learned to shoot during her first frontier year, not from romantic notions, but from practical necessity. Her hands shook from venom, but her eyes were clear. And when she sighted along the barrel, she could see Murdoch plain as day on his ridge. Her first shot split the brim of his hat, close enough to make him duck and curse. The second shattered a lantern at his horse's feet, spooking the animal and sending sparks flying in all directions. It wasn't fancy shooting. but it served its purpose, forcing the sheriff to take cover and giving the skiff precious seconds to reach the collapsed stamp mill's overhang. "Good shooting," Owen observed, impressed despite the circumstances. "Doc Boone always said you had steady hands for delicate work." They scraped through the tunnel with inches to spare, ducking low as broken timbers threatened decapitation. In sudden dimness, Tilly could smell decades of accumulated mineral deposits and sharp mercury tang processed here. The very air seemed thick with toxins. In the filtered light, seeping through gaps in wreckage, Dakota examined her ankle with the same methodical care he'd shown during the storm. The tourniquet had done its job, but swelling had worsened, and puncture wounds were beginning to seep clear fluid. He produced a small knife from his boot blade, bright with careful maintenance. "This will hurt," he said, meeting her eyes. "But poison that stays inside hurts longer." "Do what needs doing," she replied unconsciously, echoing his earlier words. He made 2 quick incisions to drain the worst of the venom. Tilly bit down on a leather strip to keep from crying out her breath, fogging his cheek as he worked. The pain was immediate and intense, but beneath it, she felt loosening sense that fire in her leg was finally beginning to cool. From her satchel, Dakota took plantain leaves she'd gathered for treating wounds. He chewed them briefly, traditional preparation, then pressed the resulting poultice against incisions and bound it with strips torn from his own shirt. "Borrow this," he said gruffly, retying her boot with leather laces cut from his leggings. The word landed with unexpected weight. In his careful English, borrow implied return, implied a future where debts could be repaid and obligations met. It was promise disguised as practicality. "I always repay my debts," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "Seen it in how you carry yourself. Woman who keeps her word has different shoulders than one who doesn't." The wagon rode to Prairie Dawn, cut through country that looked peaceful enough in growing daylight, but Tilly had learned to read signs others missed. Right now, all signs pointed to trouble. They made good time despite her ankle, Dakota moving like smoke beside her there, one moment gone the next, appearing when she needed support and vanishing when stealth mattered more. He didn't talk much, but his presence was steady and reassuring. "You never answered my question," she said during one of their brief rests. "What brought you to Snakebite Pass?" "Rumor of work," he said simply. "Man without a people has to eat somehow." "Without a people?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, sometimes doing right costs everything. But grandmother's spirit watches, and some promises outlive the flesh." By noon they could see Prairie Dawn spread in the valley below. But as they drew closer, details emerged telling a different story. Too many horses at hitching posts. Too many men lounging in doorways with the careful, casual stance of gunfighters. "He's been busy," Tilly observed. "Covering tracks," Dakota agreed. Guilty man's first instinct changed the story before anyone can tell the truth. Dr. Boone's clinic sat on town's edge, and the doctor herself waited on the front porch, medical bag at her feet, and face set in lines of professional determination mixed with personal fear. "Tilly, thank the Almighty," she said when she saw them approaching. "I was beginning to think—" She stopped, taking in Tilly's condition and the careful way Dakota supported her. "Inside, quickly." The clinic smelled of carbolic acid and old pain, but felt like sanctuary. Dr. Boone had Tilly on the examination table within minutes, cutting away makeshift bandages with practiced efficiency. "Plantain poultice," she observed approvingly. "Traditional preparation. Well done." She looked at Dakota with new respect. "You probably saved her life." "Not safe yet," he replied, glancing toward the window where dust plumes marked approaching riders. Wounded snake still has poison. Dr. Boone's mouth tightened. Edward's been here twice since dawn. First time to report you missing and presumed dead. Second time to swear out a warrant. She began preparing a fresh poultice. Sheriff Murdoch posted a bounty $50 for your return dead or alive. What manner of theft am I supposed to have committed? Tilly asked, though she suspected the answer. Silver ore from mining claims. Edward says you stole concentrate before running off with your Apache lover. The doctor's tone made clear her opinion of that story. He also claims the flood was act of God that destroyed valuable equipment. Dr. Boone. Tilly said carefully, those symptoms you've been documenting, I think I know what's causing them. Before she could elaborate, hoofbeats filled the street outside. Through the window, they could see Sheriff Murdoch and 4 deputies' horses, lathered and faces grim with purpose. Back way out, Dr. Boone said tersely. Through the storage room. But as they moved toward the building's rear, another set of riders appeared in the alley, more deputies positioned to cut off escape routes. They were trapped. That's when salvation arrived in unexpected form. Ruth Caldwell came through the clinic's front door like a small hurricane, arms full of papers and face flushed with excitement and righteous anger. Behind her came young Jesse Pike, his steady nature evident in the careful way he carried a telegraph form, still damp from transmission. Dr. Boone, Ruth called out, I need you to witness something remarkable. Sheriff Murdoch followed moments later, hand resting on gun butt. Ruth, Jesse, clear out. Official business. Oh, this is very much official business, Ruth replied with deceptive sweetness. She was 30 years old with the kind of sharp intelligence that had fled west to escape an arranged marriage to a man she despised. Jesse's been practicing his telegraphy skills, and you'll never guess what he intercepted. She unfolded her papers with a flourish. A message from Edward Hawthorne to someone in Denver, cleanup complete. Witnesses eliminated. Silver shipment on schedule. Signed E.H. The silence that followed was deafening. Sheriff Murdoch's face went through several interesting color changes, while deputies behind him shifted uncomfortably. Could mean anything, Murdoch said finally. Oh, but there's more, Ruth continued brightly. Jesse also intercepted the reply, Territorial Marshal investigating mercury poisoning reports. Maintain distance until heat dies down. Destroy all evidence. Signed S.B. Dr. Boone stepped forward, medical authority giving weight to her words. S.B. would be Silas Barrow, and mercury poisoning explains everything I've been seeing. That's when another voice cut through the tension like blade through silk. I wouldn't reach for that weapon, Sheriff. Everyone turned to see Silas Ketch standing in the doorway, his own gun already drawn and pointed with casual precision at Murdoch's chest. The hired gunman's face was battered and bruised, but his gun hand was steady as stone. Silas, Murdoch said carefully. What brings you here? Learning uncomfortable truths. Ketch replied, his voice flat and emotionless. Like the fact that my employer's been cutting his saloon whiskey with laudanum. Same poison that killed my sister 2 years back. The revelation hit like thunderbolt. Tilly remembered Billy Morrison's wife dead 3 weeks ago after drinking at the Golden Ace. The symptoms had been classic laudanum poisoning. Edward's been slowly murdering his customers for profit. Ketch continued. Mercury in the water, opium in the whiskey. This whole town's been dying by inches while he counts his silver. Sheriff Murdoch made his choice, then going for his gun with desperate speed. But Ketch had been expecting it, and his bullet took the sheriff's center mass before Murdoch's weapon cleared leather. The gunshot broke whatever spell had been holding everyone frozen. Deputies looked at their fallen sheriff, looked at evidence scattered across the examination table, and began removing their badges. "We signed on for law enforcement," one said quietly. "Not mass murder." But even as immediate crisis seemed to resolve, they could hear more riders approaching. Through the window, Edward himself appeared, leading a larger group of hired guns from out of town. "He's not surrendering," Tilly observed. Ruth's face lit with grim determination. "Then we don't defend, we attack. Jesse, that telegraph key of yours still working?" The boy grinned and held up his portable setup. "Already sent word to every ranch and farm within 50 miles. Told them the truth about the poisoning. They're coming." Through dust and heat haze, riders were approaching from multiple directions, not Edward's hired guns, but ordinary citizens who'd lost family members to mysterious illnesses and now understood why. The battle for Prairie Dawn was about to begin. The evidence lay spread across Dr. Boone's examination table like pieces of a deadly puzzle. Ruth Caldwell had been busy during the night using her newspaper connections to gather proof that would stand in any court. Jesse Pike had discovered something more disturbing than anyone imagined. "It's not just Edward and Barrow," he explained, young face grave with adult knowledge. "Look at these routing codes." He pointed to seemingly random numbers and telegraph margins. "These aren't Western Union codes. They're private signals, probably cipher. Messages with these codes go to addresses in Denver, Santa Fe, and San Francisco. Organized crime." Ruth breathed. "A conspiracy crossing territorial lines." "More than that," Jesse continued. "Look at these ore shipment weights compared to silver prices Edward's been claiming." The mathematics were damning. According to Edward's reports, the claims were producing enormous quantities of high-grade silver, but actual shipment weights were far smaller. "Smuggling," Dakota said quietly, "using mining as cover for the real business." The answer came from Silas Ketch, who'd been listening with growing alarm. "Opium," he said flatly. "Edward's been buying raw opium from Chinese suppliers in San Francisco, processing it into laudanum at the mining camp, then shipping it east as silver concentrate." But Ruth was shaking her head. "There's something else." She pulled out another document bearing the territorial marshal's official seal. "This request for medical records is dated 3 weeks ago, before any of us suspected mercury poisoning." Someone in the marshal's office knew, Tilly realized. Dakota studied the document carefully. "This signature, I've seen it before. Marshal Clayton Morse. He was coordinating military responses to Apache raids in this region. But those raids were targeting specific mining claims, always ones that weren't part of Edward and Barrow's network. The implications were staggering." "You're saying the territorial marshal is part of the conspiracy?" "I'm saying the raids I was scouting weren't Apache raids at all," Dakota replied grimly. "They were elimination of competition. Edward and Barrow were using the army to drive out legitimate miners." Final puzzle piece clicked into place with awful clarity. The raid where Dakota had refused to burn the Shepherd family's wagon that hadn't been military operation at all. It had been part of Edward and Barrow's campaign to clear territory of witnesses and competitors. Dakota had been cast out from his people for refusing to participate in a crime that wasn't even theirs. "My grandmother's choker," he said suddenly, hand moving to the beaded leather at his throat. "She told me it would remind me to protect innocence, no matter the cost. I thought I'd failed her chosen white lives over Apache honor. But it wasn't about race, it was about right and wrong." "And you chose right," Tilly said simply. In the dim light of the clinic, surrounded by evidence of conspiracy, something passed between them that went deeper than survival necessity. When his hand found hers, it wasn't seeking comfort. It was recognition, acknowledgement of two people who understood what it meant to stand alone for principle. Before either could speak, gunfire erupted outside. Edward's assault had begun, but the citizens of Prairie Dawn were ready. The assault on Dr. Boone's clinic came in carefully coordinated waves. Edward's hired guns were professionals who'd learned their trade in Kansas and Missouri during the border wars. They moved with military precision, but they were outnumbered by townspeople who had personal stakes and intimate knowledge of their territory. "We can't hold here," Dakota said, checking his weapons. "Too many windows, too many angles." "The schoolhouse," Dr. Boone suggested without looking up from her patient. "Stone foundation limited approaches." 50 yards of open ground, Tilly observed. "They'll cut us down." That's when Owen Pike arrived, with Jesse, both carrying rifles and grim expressions. The old ferryman had taken a bullet through his left arm, but had bound it with typical frontier stoicism. "Ferry's sunk," he reported. "But Jesse's got an idea." The 15-year-old possessed the innovative thinking that came from growing up where survival depended on improvisation. "Old mining equipment behind Henderson's store. There's a boiler, could make quite a distraction." "Steam explosion." Dakota grasped the concept immediately. "Fire up the boiler, jam the safety valve, let physics do the rest. Won't kill anyone directly, but it'll provide cover." Owen volunteered to handle the boiler. "No steam engines from my riverboat days. Jesse, you get that telegraph working. Time to call in the cavalry." The next 10 minutes were controlled chaos. Owen and Jesse slipped out under covering fire while the others prepared for movement. Dr. Boone packed essential supplies, Ruth gathered their evidence, and Silas Ketch provided methodical rear guard. The explosion, when it came, exceeded all expectations. The old mining boiler erupted like a volcano, sending steam and smoke skyward in a column visible for miles. Metal fragments rained down on both sides, and for a crucial moment, everyone was too stunned to fight. That was their window. Dakota scooped Tilly into his arms and ran for the schoolhouse with desperate speed. Behind them came the others, Dr. Boone supporting a wounded rancher, Ruth clutching their evidence, Ketch covering their retreat with professional precision. They reached the schoolhouse with seconds to spare. As smoke cleared, bullets began chewing chunks from stone walls, but the building was defensible with good fields of fire and limited approaches. The fighting that followed was unlike anything Prairie Dawn had ever seen. Edward had brought more than 20 professionals, but townspeople had numbers, motivation, and knowledge of every street corner and back alley. It was during the third assault that Owen Pike took his final bullet. He'd been covering the east window with patient accuracy when one of Edward's men found lucky angle and put a round through his chest. Jesse was at his father's side, instantly pressing hands against the wound. Owen looked up with eyes already glazing. "Take care of the ferry," he whispered. "People need to get across." "Pa don't talk like that." But Owen was using his last strength to grip his son's hand. "Promise me, boy. Ferry's important. Connection brings people together." Jesse nodded through tears, understanding he was receiving more than instructions about rope and boat. He was being passed a legacy that connected him to community in ways beyond transportation. Owen Pike died quietly, without fuss, but with absolute certainty about what mattered. His death crystallized what they were fighting for, not just stopping Edward and Barrow, but preserving the kind of community where honor mattered more than profit. In the confined space of the schoolhouse, as bullets whined overhead and smoke drifted through broken windows, Tilly found herself pressed against Dakota's side behind an overturned desk. His arm was around her shoulders, keeping her low, sharing warmth as desert night began to cool. "We might not survive this," she said quietly. "No," he agreed, checking his remaining ammunition. "We might not." "Then I want you to know what you did refusing that order, choosing exile, rather than killing innocents. That wasn't failure. That was the bravest thing I've ever heard." His hand tightened on her shoulder. "My grandmother used to say courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right when you're terrified." "Were you terrified?" "Every day since." He looked at her then, and she saw in his eyes all the loneliness and self-recrimination he'd carried. Until now. When their hands found each other in darkness, it wasn't romance in any conventional sense. It was recognition, acknowledgement of two people who'd found in each other something they'd thought lost forever. The assault broke against the schoolhouse like waves against stone. Edward's guns were professionals, but they fought for money while their opponents fought for home. As shadows provided cover for defenders, the hired men began reconsidering their employment. By full dark, half of Edward's force had melted away. The ones remaining were either too committed to quit or too afraid of Edward to run. That's when Marshal Clayton Morse arrived. He rode into Prairie Dawn just after midnight, leading what appeared to be territorial marshals and army regulars. On the surface, it looked like cavalry arriving to restore order. But Dakota, watching from the schoolhouse window, noticed something that chilled his blood. The soldiers weren't army at all. Their uniforms were wrong, their formation sloppy, and they moved with swagger of men used to taking rather than protecting. These were hired guns, dressed to look official. "He's not here to arrest Edward," Dakota said quietly. "He's here to finish the job." The trap had been carefully laid. By allowing townspeople to resist, Morse had given them time to gather where they could be dealt with efficiently. Now he would restore order by eliminating troublemakers, and his report would describe tragic confrontation with Apache renegades. But Morse had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed Prairie Dawn's people were sheep who would scatter when faced with federal authority. What he found were wolves, with nothing left to lose. Jesse's telegraph key began urgent chatter, sending truth racing across wires faster than bullets could stop it. Within minutes, responses flooded back from newspapers, marshals, and officials throughout the West. "They know," Ruth said simply. "Everyone knows. No covering this up now." But knowing truth and surviving to testify were different things. They needed more than moral victory. They needed to even the odds. That's when Silas Ketch made his final choice. "Where are you going?" Dr. Boone asked as he stood and walked toward the door. "To balance the scales," Ketch replied simply. "Some debts can only be paid in blood." He slipped into darkness with fluid grace of a professional killer, and what followed was masterpiece of precise violence. The first fake soldier died without sound throat cut surgically. The second managed a strangled cry before Ketch's knife found his heart. By the time alarm was raised, panic was spreading through remaining ranks. Morse's coordinated assault dissolved into chaos as his men fought an enemy they couldn't see or predict. Ketch moved through them like death itself, using every trick learned in a lifetime of killing to turn their tactics against them. But even Silas Ketch couldn't fight 20 men alone. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Another punched through his ribs, doubling him with pain. Still he kept fighting. Edward finally cornered him, emerging from behind the saloon with shotgun and murder in his eyes. "Should have stayed," bought Silas. "Should have remembered which side pays." Ketch looked up, blood streaming but gun hand steady. "My sister's name was Mary. 19 when your poisoned whiskey killed her. Died screaming, begging me to make it stop." Ancient history. Edward replied, raising the shotgun. No, Ketch said, smiling. Justice. His final shot took Edward's center mass. The businessman staggered, looked down at the spreading stain with surprise, then toppled into Prairie Dawn's muddy street. Ketch didn't live to see him fall. Morse's rifle bullet ended his life instantly. But his sacrifice had changed everything. Half the fake soldiers were dead survivors scattered, and the careful plan had collapsed. 2 days later, the real cavalry arrived. Genuine Army troopers led by authentic officers, U.S. deputy marshals, and newspaper correspondents, all drawn by Jesse Pike's telegraph messages. Marshal Morse looked up to see his conspiracy exposed, his crimes laid bare. He could have surrendered, could have tried to bargain. Instead, he chose the coward's way. His service revolver was against his temple before anyone could react. The shot echoed across the town square, bringing violence to abrupt conclusion. Except it wasn't really the end at all. As federal investigators began sifting through evidence, a disturbing pattern emerged. The body identified as Marshal Morse had the right uniform and badge, but something was wrong, subtle inconsistencies that only became apparent under examination. "That's not Morse," said Captain Williams, the Army officer leading the federal response. "I've worked with Clayton Morse for 2 years. This man's too young, wrong eye color, missing a scar on his left hand from a knife fight in Tucson." If this wasn't Morse, then who was it, and where was the real Marshal? The answer came from Jesse Pike, a coded telegram he intercepted during cleanup operations. Prairie Dawn operation failed. Witnesses survived. Recommend immediate relocation to San Francisco base. Will contact through usual channels. CM. "He's alive," Ruth whispered. "Morse is alive, and he's been using this as cover to eliminate competition." The true scope became clear. Edward and Barrow hadn't been leaders, they'd been middle management in an organization stretching coast to coast. The man they'd thought was coming to destroy them had been orchestrating events from the beginning. "San Francisco," Tilly said with quiet determination. "That's where we finish this." 3 weeks later, Tilly, Dakota, and Ruth stepped off the Central Pacific Railroad at the Oakland Long Wharf and the salt tang of San Francisco Bay, sharp in their nostrils. The city across the water rose like a fever dream of civilization. Steep hills crowned with mansions, a forest of ship masts in the harbor, and smoke from 1,000 chimneys painting the sky in shades of progress and corruption. Never seen so many people in one place, Dakota observed, watching the crowd surge around them. Even for a man who'd lived between 2 worlds, San Francisco was overwhelming, a babel of languages, a maze of ambitions, a place where fortunes were made and lost between sunrise and sunset. Ruth consulted the notes she'd compiled during their journey. Golden Gate Import Company is supposed to be on the East Street wharffront near Meigs Wharf. But according to my cousin at the Chronicle, it's been closed for renovations for the past month. Convenient timing, Tilly noted, adjusting the weight of her medical bag. The snakebite had healed, but she still favored that leg when tired. How do we get inside a closed building without attracting attention? Carefully, Dakota said. And at night. They took rooms at a modest hotel in the Mission District, far enough from the waterfront to avoid immediate notice, but close enough to observe their target. That evening, they made their first reconnaissance of the Golden Gate Import Company. The building squatted on the East Street wharffront like a stone toad, 3 stories of weathered brick and shuttered windows that spoke of legitimate commerce fallen on hard times. But there were signs for those who knew how to read them, and too many guards for an empty building, too much activity for a business under renovation, and the subtle wrongness that Tilly had learned to associate with places where suffering was manufactured for profit. Loading dock on the north side. Dakota reported returning from his circuit of the building. 2 guards, but they're more interested in their bottle than their duty. Service entrance on the east, but it's too exposed. Best approach is from the water side. There's a gap in the pier planking where we could come up underneath. What about once we're inside? Ruth asked. We need evidence, not just confirmation that something illegal is happening. Office on the 2nd floor. Tilly said, studying the building with the analytical eye she brought to difficult births. See how the windows are different frosted glass, like they need privacy for paperwork. That's where they'll keep records. They spent 2 more days observing patterns, noting shift changes, identifying which windows stayed lit latest into the night. The Golden Gate Import Company might look like a legitimate business, but it operated with the rhythms of criminal enterprise, busy during hours when honest folk were asleep, quiet when the city was awake. On their 3rd night in San Francisco, they made their move. The tide was low, exposing barnacle-crusted pilings and the rotting detritus of a working harbor. They approached from the waterside, Dakota leading the way, with the silent grace that had kept him alive through 18 months of exile. The gap in the pier planking was exactly where he'd said it would be, and they slipped through like shadows cast by moonlight. The basement of the Golden Gate Import Company smelled of opium and something else, something chemical and sharp, that made Tilly's trained nose wrinkle with recognition. Mercury, she whispered. They're still processing it here. The basement was a maze of wooden crates and glass apparatus, a chemistry laboratory disguised as a warehouse. But it was the ledgers they found in a locked cabinet that told the real story. Page after page of transactions, shipments, and payments that mapped out a criminal empire stretching from California to New York. Look at this. Ruth breathed, making quick pencil copies and rubbings, and exposing a few dry plate images with a compact box camera on a small tripod she'd brought from Prairie Dawn. They're not just smuggling opium, they're manufacturing it. Buying raw materials from Chinese suppliers, processing it here, then shipping the finished product east as everything from patent medicine to silver concentrate. But it was the correspondence file that contained the most damaging evidence. Letters bearing the signature of Clayton Morse, or rather, the man using that name, detailing the scope of the conspiracy and his plans for expansion. He's been planning this for years. Tilly realized, reading over Ruth's shoulder. Prairie Dawn wasn't just about covering up mercury poisoning. It was about eliminating competition so he could consolidate control of the entire Western opium trade. A sound from upstairs froze them all. Footsteps heavy and purposeful, moving toward the stairway leading to the basement. They'd been discovered. Back way out? Dakota asked, already moving toward the waterside entrance. Sealed. Ruth reported, testing the door they'd hoped to use for escape. We're trapped. The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by voices, at least 3 men, possibly more. In the dim light filtering through basement windows, they could see weapons gleaming in experienced hands. Mrs. Hawthorne, called a cultured voice from the stairway. Marshal Dakota? Miss Caldwell? How good of you to accept my invitation. The man who descended into the basement looked exactly like the territorial marshal they'd thought was dead, middle-aged, well-groomed, with the kind of confidence that came from wielding authority for personal gain. But there was something in his eyes that spoke of deeper corruption, older crime sins that had been accumulating interest for decades. Clayton Morse, I presume. Tilly said, her voice steady despite the guns trained on them. Or is that even your real name? Names are just tools, my dear. I've worn many over the years. He gestured for his men to keep their weapons ready, but not to fire immediately. Marcus Sullivan, if you must know, late of the Confederate Intelligence Service, more recently of wherever opportunity calls. The real Marshall Morse? Ruth asked. Dead these 2 years, I'm afraid. Quite useful, his identity opened so many doors that remained closed to a former rebel spy. Sullivan smiled with genuine pleasure. You've caused me considerable inconvenience, you know. Prairie Dawn was supposed to be a quiet operation, easily managed. Instead, you've forced me to accelerate my timeline considerably. What timeline? Dakota asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Expansion, naturally. The Western opium trade is too profitable to leave in the hands of amateurs and idealists. Within 5 years, I intend to control every gram of processed opium from San Francisco to St. Louis. Your little crusade in New Mexico was merely market correction. He moved closer, studying them with the detached interest of a scientist examining specimens. The question now is what to do with you. Killing you would be simplest, but messy. 3 crusading heroes die mysteriously in San Francisco. Questions are asked, investigations launched. Much better if you simply disappear. Into the bay, suggested one of his men. Crude, but effective, Sullivan agreed. Though first, I'm curious about something. How did you track me here? My security measures are usually quite thorough. Telegraph intercepts, Ruth said, apparently deciding that honesty might buy them time. Your coded messages weren't as secure as you thought. Sullivan's face darkened. Young Mr. Pike and his amateur cryptography. I should have eliminated him along with his father. Owen Pike died a hero, Tilly snapped, which is more than you'll ever manage. Heroes? Sullivan laughed. What romantic nonsense. I've met heroes Mrs. Hawthorne in the war in the years since. They all have one thing in common, they're dead. The world belongs to survivors, to those practical enough to adapt principles to circumstances. Is that what you call mass murder? Dakota asked quietly. Adaptation. I call it business, Sullivan replied. Supply and demand, profit and loss, the elimination of inefficiencies. You're Mr. Hawthorne and his partner were inefficient, sloppy, greedy, drawing attention to operations that functioned best in shadows. I simply corrected the market. But even as he spoke, Tilly was noticing things with the observational skills that had kept her patients alive through difficult births. Sullivan's men were positioned to prevent escape, but they were also blocking each other's fields of fire. The basement's layout, with its maze of crates and equipment, provided cover if they could reach it. And there was something else, a smell beneath the opium and mercury, something familiar. Gas, she whispered to Dakota, barely moving her lips. There's a gas leak somewhere in this building. His eyes flicked to the apparatus around them, noting the same thing she had. The subtle hiss of escaping gas, the chemical tang that spoke of danger accumulating in enclosed spaces. One spark, one muzzle flash, and the entire building would become a tomb. You're right about one thing, Dakota said to Sullivan, his voice carrying clearly in the basement's confines. The world does belong to survivors. He moved as he spoke, not toward Sullivan or his men, but toward the nearest gas lamp mounted on the basement wall. His hand found the valve, turned it, and suddenly the hiss became a roar as raw gas poured into the enclosed space. Stop him, Sullivan shouted, but his men were already coughing, choking on fumes that burned throat and lungs. In the confusion, Tilly and Ruth dove for cover behind stacked crates, while Dakota continued his deadly work, opening every gas valve he could reach. The basement filled with explosive vapor, and everyone in it understood the mathematics of the situation. One gunshot, one spark, and they would all die together. You're insane, Sullivan gasped, pulling a handkerchief over his nose and mouth. You'll kill us all. Maybe, Dakota agreed. But some things are worth dying for. Justice, truth, the lives of innocent people you've murdered for profit. Stand down. Sullivan ordered his men, who were looking increasingly nervous about their weapons. Nobody fires unless I give the word. But Ruth had been working her way around the basement's perimeter, camera in hand, documenting everything she could see in the dim light. Evidence that would survive, even if they didn't photographs, that would expose Sullivan's empire to the world. Got it, she called softly. Everything we need. That's when Sullivan made his choice. Better to risk explosion than let evidence escape. His hand moved toward his weapon, and time slowed to honey-thick moments where every decision mattered. Dakota was closest to him, but separated by 20 feet of gas-filled space. Tilly had a clear shot from behind her crate, but her weapon would create exactly the spark that would kill them all. Ruth was too far away to intervene physically, but she had something else, her magnesium ribbon flare, a small explosive charge designed to illuminate photographic subjects. She lit a short strip of magnesium ribbon, creating a brilliant white flare that singed the gas near the ceiling. The sudden flare starved the room of oxygen and scattered the gunmen without triggering a catastrophic blast. The flames raced along the ceiling, consuming oxygen and gas in a spectacular display that left them all coughing and blinded but alive. In the chaos that followed, Sullivan's men broke for the stairs, more concerned with survival than duty. Sullivan himself tried to follow, but Dakota was on him before he reached the first step, and the two men went down in a tangle of fists and fury. It was over in moments. Sullivan was older, softer, accustomed to having others do his violence for him. Dakota was a man who'd survived exile and hardship through strength and will. When they separated, only one was still moving. "Is he dead?" Ruth asked, approaching cautiously. Dakota checked for pulse, found none. Yes, justice served one way or another. They gathered their evidence and made their way out of the burning building as fire bells began ringing throughout the city. By dawn, the Golden Gate Import Company was ashes and rubble, but the photographs and documents they'd recovered were safe in the hands of federal marshals and newspaper editors. The trials that followed were a sensation throughout the territory and beyond. Sullivan's empire crumbled as investigators rolled up network after network of corruption, each revelation leading to new arrests and convictions. The opium trade continued, but it would never again operate with the impunity that Sullivan had achieved through his stolen identity and government connections. 6 months after San Francisco burned, Tilly and Dakota were married by Dr. Eliza Boone in Prairie Dawn Schoolhouse, surrounded by friends who understood that some bonds were forged in fire and tested by blood. Jesse Pike, now 16 and managing his father's ferry with quiet competence, gave the bride away. Ruth Caldwell served as maid of honor, her career as an investigative journalist, launched by the series of articles that had brought down Sullivan's conspiracy. They settled in Denver, where Tilly established a practice treating environmental poisoning cases, and Dakota continued his work as a federal marshal. Their first child, a daughter, was born in spring of 1879 and named Mary Elizabeth Mary for Silas Ketch's sister Elizabeth for Dr. Boone. On quiet evenings when work was done and children were asleep, they would sometimes talk about that night in Snakebite Pass when a flood had brought them together. But mostly, they didn't need words. Some stories were too big for conversation, too important for casual telling. They were written instead, in the lives they'd saved, the communities they'd protected, the children who grew up in a world where clean water and honest law were possible, because two damaged people had found each other in a storm and refused to let evil triumph over good. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.